All right. Hey, everyone, and welcome back to the deep dive. If you're prepping for the UPSC exam, especially that international relations paper, you've probably come across this pretty complex topic.
That's a tough one.
Yeah, humanitarian intervention. Today, we're going to do a deep dive into this.
Yeah.
It's not just for the exam, though.
Yeah.
It's something that's, well, it's relevant for anyone who wants to understand, how the world works. Like, when should one country get involved in another country's problems?
Right. And it's a real dilemma. I mean, you have state sovereignty on the one hand, the idea that countries should be left alone to govern themselves.
Mhm.
But on the other hand, what happens when a government is committing atrocities against its own people? I mean, do we just stand by and watch?
Right. So it's kind of this clash between, like you said, sovereignty, the right to be left alone, and this responsibility to protect human lives. Like, where do you draw the line?
Exactly. And that's what makes it so intellectually stimulating. And, to be honest, a bit of a headache for policymakers.
For sure. And it's not just a theoretical debate,
Yeah.
right? We're talking about real-world situations, wars, genocide, human rights abuses. I mean, these are real things happening out there.
Yeah.
So before we get into all the ethical arguments and the laws, I want to start with a basic question. Does humanitarian intervention actually work? Like, does it actually achieve what it sets out to do?
Well, it seems obvious, right? Like, if we're trying to stop something terrible from happening, any action is better than none.
Right.
But the thing is, it's incredibly difficult to measure the effectiveness of intervention. I mean, how do you know what would have happened if you hadn't intervened?
Oh, the what ifs.
Exactly, the what ifs. Would things have been even worse? I mean, it's almost impossible to know for sure.
Yeah, it's a mind game for sure.
Yeah.
But there have been cases where, at least it seems like, intervention really did prevent a lot of suffering.
Hmm.
Our source material, it highlights a few of these, like
Oh.
Northern Iraq back in 91 and Kosovo in 99.
Yeah, those are often cited as successes. In northern Iraq, they set up a no-fly zone after the Gulf War, and it did seem to protect the Kurdish population from Saddam Hussein. And then in Kosovo, the NATO intervention, it was controversial,
Right.
but it's generally credited with stopping the ethnic cleansing of the Kosovar Albanians.
Right.
And in both of those cases, the use of airstrikes, strategic airstrikes by NATO,
Right.
really minimized casualties among the intervening forces, which made the interventions much more acceptable to the international community.
Right, because, less risk for the intervening countries.
Exactly. And the text also mentions Sierra Leone in 2007, where intervention led to positive outcomes like democratic elections being held. So,
Right.
it's not all doom and gloom.
So there are instances where intervention has, seemingly made a positive difference.
Yes, definitely. But of course, like always in international relations, things are never black and white. There are always shades of gray. For every apparent success story, you have cases where intervention has been less effective or even, harmful.
Right.
The text reminds us of some pretty stark examples. UN peacekeeping failures in Congo, for instance,
Right.
the rather quick abandonment of the intervention in Somalia. And then, of course, you have the long, drawn-out conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Yeah.
I mean, these examples really highlight the risk of unintended consequences.
Right.
I mean, how do you impose peace from the outside, and what happens when you, replace one form of oppression with another? You might just end up making things worse.
Right. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound sometimes.
Yeah.
It might stop the bleeding temporarily, but it's not going to fix the underlying problem.
Exactly. And that's why it's so crucial to consider the long-term effects of intervention. Is the stability that's imposed from the outside, is it truly sustainable?
That's a really good question. And I think it leads us to the heart of the ethical debate. Like, even though we assume that intervention can work sometimes,
Yeah.
is it ever truly justified? I mean, should one country ever interfere in the affairs of another?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah. And our source material dives deep into this debate, presenting a whole range of arguments, both for and against intervention.
Right.
And before we get into that, we're not here to tell you what to think.
No, absolutely not.
We're just going to unpack these arguments, explore the nuances,
Right.
and maybe even challenge some of our own assumptions along the way.
For sure.
So let's start with the arguments in favor of intervention. What are some of the most compelling reasons why a country might decide to get involved in another country's conflict?
Well, the most common argument, and maybe the most intuitively appealing, is the idea of shared humanity.
Right.
It's this belief that we have a moral obligation to help those in need, It doesn't matter where they live, what their nationality is.
Right.
We're all human beings, and we have a responsibility to each other.
So it's like if you saw someone drowning,
Yeah.
you wouldn't just stand there and watch, would you?
Yeah. Right. You'd try to help, even if you didn't know them. And the argument is that the same principle applies on a global scale.
Right.
We can't just stand by and watch while atrocities are being committed in another part of the world.
It's a powerful argument. It appeals to our sense of compassion, our empathy.
Exactly.
But isn't there also a practical side to this?
Of course.
Like, beyond the moral imperative,
Yeah.
couldn't you argue that sometimes intervention is necessary to prevent a crisis from spreading,
Right.
from destabilizing entire regions?
Absolutely. That's where the argument of global interdependence comes in.
Right.
It acknowledges that we live in an interconnected world. What happens in one place can have ripple effects everywhere.
Right.
I mean, think about refugee crises, for example. When masses of people are fleeing conflict or persecution, it destabilizes neighboring countries, strains resources,
Yeah.
creates security challenges.
For sure.
And the same goes for infectious diseases.
Right.
A pandemic in one part of the world can quickly become a global threat.
So even from a purely self-interested perspective,
Mhm.
it sometimes makes sense to intervene,
Yes.
to prevent a problem from becoming bigger, more costly down the line.
Exactly. And that's an important consideration, especially for, UPSC aspirants who need to understand the realpolitik consideration.
Right. Realpolitik, the idea that countries ultimately act in their own self-interest.
Exactly.
So sometimes acting in the interest of others also serves your own long-term interest.
Precisely. But beyond these more immediate concerns, there's also a long-term argument for humanitarian intervention, which is the promotion of democracy and human rights.
Oh, okay. So the idea is that by intervening in dictatorships,
Right.
you can create space for these values, these institutions
Yeah.
to take root.
Exactly. And the hope is that over time, this will lead to greater stability, greater respect for human rights.
So it's not just about stopping immediate suffering. It's about fostering a more just, more peaceful world order.
That's the argument. And finally, there's the argument that humanitarian intervention strengthens the international community as a whole.
How so?
Well, by demonstrating a commitment to shared values, a willingness to act collectively against these really egregious violations of human rights, it sets a precedent,
Okay.
It strengthens the norms of international law.
So you're saying that it shows that the world is serious about upholding these values, about holding perpetrators accountable.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got a pretty solid case for intervention here.
We do.
But like we said, there's another side to this story.
There is.
What are some of the main arguments against getting involved in other countries' messes?
Well, one of the most fundamental objections comes from the realist perspective. They argue that intervening in another country's internal affairs, even for noble reasons, violates a core principle of international state sovereignty.
Right, that idea that countries have the right to govern themselves without interference?
Exactly. And so even if your intentions are good, you're undermining global order by interfering in another country's right to rule itself.
So you could actually be doing more harm than good, even if you're trying to help.
That's the argument. And realists are also, they tend to be pretty skeptical of states' motives,
Right.
They believe that national interest always trumps altruism.
So even when a country claims to be acting out of humanitarian concern, there's always a hidden agenda at play.
But that's the realist view. They'd say, look for the strategic interests, the economic interests driving the intervention.
And they probably have a point, right?
They do. I mean, history is full of examples where humanitarian intervention has been used as a pretext for pursuing national interests.
Right, so it's all about power politics in the end.
Well, realists would certainly argue that.
Okay, that makes sense. And it leads us to another issue, the issue of double standards.
Yeah.
Why do some crises warrant intervention while others are ignored? Is it really about the severity of the situation, or are there other factors at play?
That's a crucial point. And our source material highlights this inconsistency. It suggests that decisions about intervention are often influenced by things like media attention, geopolitical interests, or simply the political feasibility of action.
So it's not always about objective need.
Not necessarily, which raises questions about fairness, about the true commitment to humanitarian principles.
Right.
I mean, the interventions in Iraq and Libya, for example, have been criticized for being motivated more by strategic interests than genuine concern for the people there.
Yeah.
And then you have situations like the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar, where the international community has been much slower to act, despite clear evidence of human rights abuses.
Okay, so we've got the legal argument, the realist perspective, the problem of double standards. What else?
Another criticism is that humanitarian intervention often oversimplifies complex conflicts. It tends to frame situations as this clear-cut battle between good and evil,
Right.
ignoring all the nuances, the moral ambiguities that are often present in real-world conflicts.
Right, because it's rarely a simple case of villains and victims.
Exactly. Reducing a complex conflict to this simplistic narrative can lead to misguided policies, to unintended consequences.
For sure. I think that leads to another important criticism, the idea that humanitarian intervention can be a form of cultural imperialism.
Yes, absolutely.
Can you explain that a bit more?
Well, the idea is that intervening in other societies, even with the best of intentions, can be seen as imposing Western values on other cultures,
Right.
especially when it comes to human rights.
So whose definition of humanitarian are we using? Whose values are we prioritizing?
Exactly. It raises some uncomfortable questions about ethnocentric bias, about the potential for interventions to do more harm than good.
Wow. This is really challenging my assumptions about humanitarian intervention.
It's a complex issue.
Yeah, far more complex than I initially realized.
It's a minefield of ethical dilemmas, legal complexities, political calculations, and there are no easy answers. Every case has to be judged on its own merits.
Okay, so we've laid out the battleground, but where do we go from here?
Well, our source material offers a potential compass, the responsibility to protect, or R2P.
R2P, I've heard of that.
It's an attempt to bridge the gap between state sovereignty and the responsibility to protect populations from mass atrocities. It's a framework for understanding when and how the international community should respond to these kinds of crises.
So R2P, it's like a set of guidelines, a kind of ethical roadmap for dealing with these really complex situations.
Exactly. And it's not just about military intervention, it's much broader than that. It encompasses prevention, reaction, and rebuilding. In fact, it places a strong emphasis on preventing humanitarian crises from happening in the first place.
Okay, so R2P is not just about reacting to crises after they happen. It's about trying to prevent them altogether.
Precisely. And that's where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive.
Awesome. So stay tuned, folks. We'll be right back after a quick break to explore the 3 pillars of R2P. It is. And we'll see how this framework tries to strike a balance between respecting state sovereignty and protecting human lives. Don't go anywhere.
We'll be right back.
And we're back with the deep dive.
All right, so we were just talking about this this concept, this framework,
Yeah.
the responsibility to protect, or R2P. Like it's trying to bring some order to this whole humanitarian intervention debate.
It really is. It's an ambitious concept, trying to reconcile those 2 principles we talked about, state sovereignty,
Right.
the idea that countries should be able to govern themselves without outside meddling,
Right.
and then, the responsibility to protect populations from these horrible things.
Yeah, the atrocities, the genocide.
Exactly. Genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity. R2P is all about figuring out when and how the international community should respond.
Okay, so it's not just about sending in the troops, right? It's a bigger idea than that.
Much broader. It's about prevention, reaction, and rebuilding. In fact, it really stresses preventing these crises from happening in the first place. Okay, so walk me through this. What does preventing a humanitarian crisis actually look like?
Well, it means addressing the root causes of conflict and human rights abuses,
Right.
Poverty, inequality, discrimination, corrupt governments, lack of education, healthcare. All these things contribute to instability, and that's where violence and oppression can flourish.
So it's not just about sending in troops after the fact. It's about tackling these deeper issues.
Yeah, these are the underlying issues that can lead to crises.
Right.
And, that's a tall order. It's complicated.
Yeah, I mean, the world is a messy place.
It is, but the logic, it makes sense, right?
Yeah.
I mean, prevention's always better than intervention.
Sure.
Less costly in terms of lives and resources.
Right.
And you avoid all those thorny ethical and legal questions about interfering in another country.
Right. But, okay, let's be real. Prevention doesn't always work. Sometimes those crises do erupt.
They do.
So what then? What does R2P say about reacting?
Well, the reaction pillar. It acknowledges that when a state fails to protect its own people from these mass atrocities, The responsibility shifts to the international community.
So someone has to step in.
Yeah, and that could involve a whole range of measures: humanitarian aid, sanctions, peacekeeping forces, and then, as a last resort, military intervention.
Okay, so that brings us back to that whole debate about when it's okay to intervene.
Right.
So R2P, it doesn't rule out the use of force,
No.
but it makes it clear that it should be a last resort.
Absolutely a last resort.
And that even then, you have to be incredibly careful to minimize civilian casualties.
Absolutely. R2P recognizes that intervening, even when you have good intentions, can make things worse.
Right.
Unintended consequences. It's not a magic wand, you know?
Right, right. So even with these guidelines, there are going to be challenges.
Oh, for sure. One of the biggest is getting everyone on board. You need the international community, especially the powerful countries, to agree on what to do.
And that's not always easy.
Not at all. The UN Security Council, for instance, you know they're theoretically in charge of authorizing interventions.
Right, but they can get stuck.
Oh, absolutely. Vetoes from permanent members like Russia or China can just stop everything, even when there's a clear humanitarian crisis happening.
So again, we see how realpolitik, those national interests,
Yeah,
can override these ethical considerations.
they can, unfortunately. And even when everyone agrees that intervention is necessary, there are practical issues. Getting the resources, coordinating military action, making sure you don't actually prolong the conflict.
Right, right. Okay, so let's imagine you've overcome all those hurdles, you intervened, and the crisis is over. What then? Does everyone just pack up and go home?
Not at all. That's where the third pillar of R2P comes in: rebuilding. And it's often the most neglected part.
Really?
It is. But it's crucial for long-term stability, for preventing future crises. UPSC aspirants, they know this. You can't just offer quick fixes. You need holistic solutions.
Right, yeah, the exam definitely tests your understanding of that.
It does. R2P gets that. Sustainable peace, it takes more than just stopping the fighting.
Right.
You have to rebuild shattered societies, address those root causes of conflict we were talking about, promote reconciliation, foster economic development, build up democratic institutions, and make sure the rule of law is upheld.
Wow, that's a lot.
It is.
Yeah.
And it requires a long-term commitment from the international community. You can't just show up, do a quick intervention, and then leave.
Right.
A lot of times, interventions fail to achieve lasting peace because they don't pay enough attention to this rebuilding phase.
That makes me think of Afghanistan.
Yeah.
The U.S.-led intervention in 2001, it toppled the Taliban.
Yes.
But then the nation-building efforts, they were just incredibly difficult.
They were.
And in the end, they weren't successful.
Yeah.
The Taliban came back.
It's a tragic case. It really shows how important it is to have that comprehensive approach. You can't just focus on the immediate security threat. You have to address the political, economic, and social factors that are driving the conflict. And it really reinforces the importance of that prevent pillar we were talking about.
Yeah.
Preventing conflict is really hard. It means tackling poverty, corruption, inequality. And you need international cooperation, political will, and a lot of resources.
Right.
And sometimes, even when you have all of that, it still might not work.
Okay, so we've got these three pillars: prevent, react, rebuild. And it's a promising framework, but there are definitely some serious real-world challenges. I guess the question is, who decides when and how to intervene? Who's actually calling the shots?
That's a good question. And it gets to the heart of how power works in international relations.
Right.
In theory, the UN Security Council is the one with the authority to authorize intervention.
Right, right. But they can be a bit dysfunctional sometimes.
They can, especially because of that veto power that the permanent members have.
Right, those 5 permanent members.
Exactly. So you can have situations where a powerful country might block an intervention simply because it doesn't serve its own interests.
Even if there's a huge humanitarian crisis going on.
Yes. And we've seen this happen, for example, in Syria.
Right.
Russia and China have repeatedly blocked resolutions condemning the Assad regime, despite all the evidence of human rights abuses.
Right. So even with R2P, it's still possible for countries to put their own interests above the needs of people who are suffering.
It's a frustrating reality, but it's the reality of international politics.
Okay, so the Security Council, they're not always up to the task.
Yeah.
But what happens when they're paralyzed like that? Are there other ways to intervene? Can regional organizations or individual countries step in?
That's where things get even murkier. I mean, the UN Charter, it says that the Security Council is primarily responsible for maintaining peace and security.
Okay.
But it doesn't explicitly say that no one else can act.
So it's a bit of a gray area.
It is. And
Yeah.
so you get debates about whether it's legal or legitimate to intervene without the Security Council's say-so.
Right. And that brings us back to Kosovo. NATO intervened there, even though they didn't have a UN mandate.
Exactly. They argued it was necessary to stop the ethnic cleansing that was happening, but that intervention was controversial.
Yeah, some people said it set a dangerous precedent.
They did, because it raises the question of how far a country can go to protect people and what happens when the Security Council is just unable or unwilling to act.
Right. It's tricky, so it seems like every situation is going to be unique.
It is. You have to weigh the potential benefits of intervention against the potential risks, the legal considerations, the ethical implications. There's no one-size-fits-all answer.
It's all about nuance. It's about understanding the complexities of each situation. No easy answers.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to really think critically about these issues, to understand the different viewpoints, the historical context, the laws, the ethical dilemmas. It's all connected.
Okay, I feel like we've laid some good groundwork here. We've looked at the arguments for and against intervention, and we've unpacked this R2P framework. But the real test is applying these concepts to the real world. And that's what we'll do in the final part of our deep dive.
I agree. We'll take another look at some of those examples we discussed, like Northern Iraq, Kosovo, Afghanistan,
Right.
and we'll analyze them through the lens of R2P. We'll see how this framework helps us understand what worked, what didn't work, and what the ongoing challenges are.
Sounds good. I'm ready to dive back in. Welcome back to the deep dive. All right, so we've explored a lot of the theory behind humanitarian intervention. The big question now is, how does all this actually play out in the real world?
Yeah, exactly. It's one thing to talk about concepts and frameworks, but things get a lot messier when you're dealing with real people, real conflicts.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to do now. We're going to revisit some of the examples we've touched upon earlier, looking at them through the lens of R2P, the responsibility to protect.
It's a good way to see how this framework actually works or doesn't work in practice.
Right. So let's start with the intervention in northern Iraq in 1991. You know, the no-fly zone that was established to protect the Kurds from Saddam Hussein. Looking back, how does this case measure up against the principles of R2P?
Well, the establishment of the no-fly zone, you could definitely argue that it was a successful example of that react pillar of R2P. I mean, it did what it was supposed to do. It stopped the immediate violence against the Kurds, gave them a safe haven.
So it fulfilled that immediate responsibility to protect. But what about the bigger picture? Did it help prevent future violence?
To a certain extent, yes. I mean, the no-fly zone, it did act as a deterrent. Saddam Hussein knew that if he attacked again, there would be consequences. But the intervention didn't really address the deeper political and historical issues that led to the crisis in the first place.
Right, so it was a Band-Aid solution in a way. It stopped the bleeding, but it didn't heal the wound.
That's a good analogy.
And what about rebuilding? Was there a real effort to help the Kurdish region recover after years of oppression?
Well, there was some humanitarian assistance, that's for sure. But the international community's focus was mainly on maintaining that no-fly zone and preventing further attacks. Those long-term rebuilding and reconciliation efforts, they kind of fell by the wayside.
And that's interesting, right? It makes you wonder if, in a way, the intervention, while it was successful in the short term, maybe it actually created a kind of dependency on external protection. Like the international community stepped in to be the protector, but without a clear plan for what happens next.
It's a valid point, and it highlights one of the really tough dilemmas of humanitarian intervention. Even when it works in the short term, it can sometimes create new problems or make existing ones even worse.
Okay, let's move on to another case. The NATO intervention in Kosovo in 1999. Now, this one was really controversial because it happened without a clear mandate from the UN Security Council. So how does this one fit into the R2P framework?
Kosovo is a really interesting case, because it really shows that tension between state sovereignty and the responsibility to protect. I mean, NATO basically said, we have to stop this ethnic cleansing, even if the UN doesn't give us permission.
Right. It was a bold move, to say the least. But did it actually work?
Well, the intervention did stop the violence. Serbian troops withdrew from Kosovo, and that definitely saved lives and prevented further atrocities. But it also raised a lot of questions about the legality of intervening without the Security Council's approval. And some people argued that it set a bad precedent, that it could give powerful countries an excuse to intervene whenever they want without any real oversight.
So again, a mixed bag. Short-term success, but with potential long-term consequences. And what about the aftermath? Did the rebuilding process get the attention it needed?
Well, Kosovo has come a long way since then. They've made progress in rebuilding and establishing democratic institutions.
Hmm.
But it's been a slow and difficult process. And the legacy of the conflict, those ethnic tensions and political disputes, they haven't gone away.
Okay, let's look at one last case study. The U.S.-led intervention in Afghanistan in 2001. Now, this is often seen as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the limits of intervention.
It is. In the beginning, the intervention had a lot of international support. It was seen as a justifiable response to the 9/11 attacks and the Taliban support for al-Qaeda. And at first, there were real improvements in human rights, especially for women and girls.
Right, but the nation-building efforts that followed, those proved to be much, much harder. The conflict dragged on for 20 years, with a huge cost in terms of lives, both Afghan civilians and international forces. And in the end, the Taliban came back to power.
Yeah, the Afghanistan case is a really stark reminder that military intervention, even when you have the best intentions, it doesn't guarantee long-term success. It shows how important it is to not just stop the fighting, but to also address the underlying causes of conflict. And it shows how important that long-term commitment to rebuilding is.
Absolutely. You can't just go in, fix things quickly, and then expect everything to be okay.
Right. Afghanistan also shows just how difficult that prevent pillar of R2P is to put into practice. Preventing conflict means dealing with these deep-rooted problems like poverty, corruption, inequality. It needs global cooperation, political will, and a lot of resources. And even then, sometimes it's just not enough.
Wow, we've covered a lot today. It's clear that humanitarian intervention is complex with no easy answers. So as we wrap up, what are some key takeaways for our listeners, especially those getting ready for the UPSC exam?
Well, I think the first thing is to embrace the complexity. Don't try to oversimplify these issues or see them as black and white. The UPSC exam, it demands that you can analyze things in a nuanced way, and that means being able to see things from different perspectives.
Right, it's not about memorizing arguments, it's about understanding the underlying principles, the history, the legal frameworks, and the potential consequences of different actions.
Exactly. Second, it's important to be familiar with those key concepts and frameworks, like R2P, know its strengths, its weaknesses, when it worked, when it didn't work, and be ready to apply it to real-world examples.
And finally, and maybe most importantly, develop your critical thinking skills. The UPSC exam, it's not about just repeating information. It's about showing that you can analyze, synthesize, form your own well-reasoned arguments.
Exactly. Take the knowledge you gain from the deep dive, from your textbooks, from your own research, and use it to engage with the world. Question your assumptions, challenge the conventional wisdom, and come to your own informed conclusions.
Because, in the end, the goal of studying international relations isn't just about passing an exam. It's about becoming a more engaged and informed citizen, someone who can understand and navigate this complex and interconnected world we live in.
Well said. Couldn't have put it better myself.
And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into humanitarian intervention. We've wrestled with tough ethical questions, looked at legal frameworks, and explored the often messy realities of how these ideas play out in the real world. I hope you found it challenging, but also enlightening. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this, so leave a comment below, share your insights, and keep the conversation going. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like, subscribe, and spread the word. We'll be back soon with more explorations of fascinating and important topics. Until then, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.